Hello, we're going to give people a minute or two to join. Now, as we go through this webinar today, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to add them directly to the chat and make sure that you are sending the question to everyone and not just host and panelists. As we wait for a couple more people to join, feel free to add where you're calling from in the chat. I'm calling from Montreal today. Miami, amazing. You must be having good weather too. Phoenix, Calgary, another Canadian, that's fun. West Palm Beach, Jacksonville, Florida. Ooh, steamy. Must be hot. It's hot here too. Alrighty, so welcome to today's Tiger Hall webinar. Our session features Nellie Wartoff, CEO of Tiger Hall. Today's topic, how to do change activation for ERP implementations. Nellie, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you everyone for conquering the different heat waves across the world and joining us for the session on ERP implementations. Because nothing hotter than implementing an ERP, isn't it? So that's what we'll be chatting about today. I'm the founder and CEO of Tiger Hall, which is a change activation platform supporting many large global organizations with ERP implementations. And what we're going to talk about today is some tactical ways of how do you actually do change activation in practice. So that means it's going to be some PowerPoint slides, of course, but also a lot of practical showing you how this all actually works, how it comes together, how you implement, how you measure, and so on. So getting down to the tactics so you can see it in practice too. But I want to kick off with a poll and just seeing, for those of you in the room, where are you at in your ERP journey right now? And some of you might be joining without having an ERP project, just out of curiosity and for the fun of it. That's absolutely fine as well. But for those of you who are, let us know where you are in that journey right now. And that would help us tailor the session a little bit as we go. And we'll give people another 15 seconds to respond to this. Okay, this is interesting. So a little over half are in planning and pre-implementation. Great stage to be in. And I would say then you're in exactly the right place. So this is a great time for you to dive into how do we deploy, how do we implement in that phase. Some are mid-rollout, and it's never too late to do things differently. So that's good as well. Some have recently went live and are post-go live or done multiple ERP programs. But primarily, this audience seems to be in that planning and pre-implementation phase. Awesome. That's great. And as we go, feel free to put questions and thoughts in the chat as well. And I always say the common wisdom of this room together is just as great as what we'll be sharing from the stage here with you. So feel free to share your own observations and your learnings and so on with the others in the room as well in the chat as we go. All right. So kicking off with what kind of ERP implementations are we having? This is what we tend to see. Two different types of ERP implementations. And you see the ones that have very high adoption in the beginning, and then it tends to quite quickly die after that. And then we have the ones that succeed in building long-term adoption. I would say this is the hardest thing in ERP for the reason that within an ERP system, when you implement it, there are so many different modules, right? And so many different people in an organization who use those different modules at different points in time. So it's not like you have everyone is using the system in the same way or using the same kind of tool. It's a rather complex implementation, as you all are familiar with. And that's why when we talk about activation, what we'll show today is very much focused on how do we drive what's on the right side of the slide. Because we all know how to do the left side. Like we do a ton of stuff beforehand. We engage consultants. We bring in a lot of communications. We go everything like out, go live. And then the project ends. And then we don't really know what happens after that. So sustained adoption is really the core concept of what we'll be talking about. So we get more on the right than on the left side of it. Because looking at the left side, which is the most common, that's where most of ERP implementations tend to fail as well. So between 55 to 75% is the common metric of how many are actually failing to meet their required objectives. User adoption tends to be the number one issue that organizations are facing in implementing ERP. And many times that comes down to just inadequate change management and ensuring that sustainment part, especially. Because it's very easy to do things over a couple of weeks, but it's very hard to then maintain that momentum over time. So, immediately, one more question before we start diving into it. What is your biggest challenge in the ERP implementation, or what has been? And for those of you who are in the pre-planning of maybe your first implementation, maybe select the one that you foresee being the biggest challenge if you haven't been through the implementation yet. We'll give it another 10 seconds. All right, so pretty spread out, and it seems like maybe some of you wanted to select all of the above to these as well. But top one definitely being getting teams to change how they work. And that is for sure very difficult in all types of change, just like how they work. And when it comes to ERP, right, as we all know, it's not just a technology rollout and just click here, click there, but it's actually changing processes and behaviors and operating model many times and workflow operations, etc. So can totally see how that's a very, very difficult part. And moving too fast, I mean, everything should be done tomorrow, shouldn't it? And then the siloed rollout as well with different teams. And we'll touch on this a bit as well with the siloed pieces. When you have different teams having different experience, how do we solve for that? Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So one of the things in traditional ones, before we dive into change activation, this tends to be what it looks like today. And the way that many organizations are planning for and project managing and rolling out ERP tends to be very, very focused on what the project managers or change managers, implementation managers should do. So it's a fairly self-viewed lens on how the rollout should happen. And it tends to begin with some kind of strategy, selection of the ERP provider, of course, usually engaging some consultants around it, many times a big four, and like some kind of implementation partner. You go through the UAT testing and then you go live. And then many times after that, it's praying for the best and hoping that people adopt it. And I know many times that we want to spend more time on sustainment and adoption too, but we might not have the resources to do so. So we'll touch on that as well. But that is the most critical phase. And looking at organizations that realize a ton of value out of their ERP investments, which, as we know, is many times 10, 20, 30, $40 million. The ones who realize that value and the ones who don't tends to be the difference is what happens after go live. So we'll touch on that. So diving in then to change activation and not treating go live as the finish line on a project, what is the opposite of doing this? How can we realize that ROI, get those financial benefits and not having redundant systems with two at the same time? How do we solve for this? So when we talk about change activation, the model behind this is a very agile model, right? So think of this as this is the opposite of sitting in a boardroom for 6 months, coming up with a beautiful, pretty plan, and then it starts going south in week 2. This is being always on, being agile and keep changing as you go. And there are 3 key ingredients to it. So one is alignment, which is how do we align people to what is expected of them? And this is the opposite of broad brush communications and telling everyone, hey, we're getting a new ERP, because that's just noise to most. But how do we personalize to exactly what's going to change in their role? What's important? What's in it for them? What is expected from them? What should they be doing differently? All of that comes into alignment. Then, of course, adoption, which tends to come down to reinforcement, sustainment. How do we keep this over long periods of time? And as you know, in ERP, some modules, some systems and workflows you use every single day. And there will be people who will get these ways of working in a period of 3 to 4 weeks because they do it daily. Other things will be something you do quarterly or annually, and it requires a whole different level of sustainment. And then adaptation, which is the most critical piece, I would argue, which is the data-driven piece of this, to be able to measure what is going well, where are we seeing adoption, where are we not seeing adoption. And this is where we see between organizations that are doing this, the ones who move the fastest are never ever the ones with the perfect plans, where they have everything nailed down and they have this perfect communication strategy and everything is looking beautiful. Those are not the ones who succeed. The ones who succeed are the ones that can pivot the fastest and that can adapt to reality and see what is happening, see what happens in execution, what's going well, what's not, and then being able to pivot and course correct throughout. And then having all of those three working in tandem, coming together as one loop is really what drives change activation at large scale over a long period of time. So we'll go through each of these one by one and look a bit tactically at some examples of how this is done. So starting with alignment, a key concept here is, of course, personalization. If we were all looking at each other's Instagram feeds, we probably wouldn't spend as much time on Instagram as we are when we look at our own feeds. And that's the same with personalization, right? Like if you receive the same information as everyone else is receiving, then you're not going to be as interested in that. So the critical point here is building it down to the person and who they are, what they do, and what they need when. And when people think of personalization, it's very easy to start by just thinking of demographics. Like, okay, our finance team in Mexico, our sales team in France, and like thinking of just those demographics. But there are a couple of other things that are more important, I would argue, when it comes to personalization. So think of personalization as kind of a grading scale with different levels. Most organizations still do no personalization. And I think that's a big reason for them not seeing as much success, because as we all know, when you get bombarded with so many different messages, you start filtering out and people just start ignoring it. So mass rollouts, entire populations, everyone get the broad announcements, town halls, hey, new ERP, this is coming. Hard to drive adoption in that. Like you get that initial go live spike that we looked at in that graph to the left, but hard to sustain that. Then we get to the demography based personalization. So this is where many organizations think like, oh, this is personalization. So like what we spoke, finance department, and this is the budgeting module, or people in a certain country, etc. What is most powerful when you look at ERP is actually workflow-based personalization, because you can have two people in the finance department, but who have massively different workflows and how they adopt different modules and what they do when, at what time of the month, and things like that. So being able to personalize it based on what they do and how often they do it. So both think of which workflows, what frequency, and when in the time that they do that, that's what you want to tailor to. So not just who they are, but also what they do. So to look at some examples of what this looks like when you use change activation platforms, then if we think of demographics, this is what you have up here. So, and it's always good to start with demographics. I think demographics is a really good foundation. So looking at, for example, employee functions like finance and sales, for the purpose of what we'll show today, we'll think of a sales process, sales order process example in an ERP in SAP, for example. So then you might want to look at people in finance and sales who are at manager level, who are based in the US or Mexico. So that's an example of like initial baseline demographics, right? And then you might also want to target people who report into Patricia, for example. Say Patricia Clark is one of the BU leaders in the GBS, and you want to target everyone who reports to her who sits in the US or Mexico as a manager in finance and sales. So this then covers your demographic. Then what you do is looking at the different workflows here. So let's say we're implementing SAP, say S/4HANA. You want to target people who are doing the sales order creation the first time. So the first time they do this, that's when they get moved into this persona, and that immediately triggers different enablement for them. So personalization is not just who they are, but also what they do. And this could then be like the first time they do it, if they end it. So maybe once they've completed that process, you want them to then go on and do something different in the ERP or reinforce differently. Then you can also target the ones who are ending that sales order creation process. And you can also look at time windows, right? So frequency of usage that we spoke about, that's another big driver of personalization. Because you, again, might have two people in finance in the US under Patricia, but how often they do sales order creation are very different. So in the last 30 days, you can then target people who have done this, say, at least 10 times. So every third day, they're creating a sales order. Now, that's a very different persona compared to people who've done this at most 3 times in, say, the last 90 days. Now, this might be a low adoption persona. So you want to be able to tailor it based on how people are moving through these different personas. And a key point here, right, is that this will be different for different workflows and different audiences. And this is really the key to driving sustainment over time. Because what it does is that the system then captures once people fall out of adoption. So let's say here you define a low adoption group, a medium adoption group, and a high adoption group under the sales order creation process. Now, if I do it 10 times in a month, I'll be in the high adoption group, right? But then let's say, I start doing my own pen and paper, I find some way around it, and I start circumventing the system and I'm out of adoption, the system will then capture that and bring it back in. So we'll keep bringing these people back in once they change their behavior in the ERP. So then suddenly, let's say now I only did it 3 times in the last 90 days. Suddenly now I'm in the low adoption persona. And without you having to do anything, the system will say, oh, Nelly is now low adoption. She's not high adoption anymore. So all the enablement, all the nudges, the sustainment, reinforcement, everything will change because now I'm meeting a different persona. So that's when we talk about change activation from a workflow personalization. It covers both the first time they do something, the 10th time they do something, when they end a process, frequency of usage. So you want to be able to capture how often, how frequently people are doing these different systems. And then you can also match this with bring in a change impact assessment, right? So you might want to capture specific people who are affected by review and approval. So in the change impact assessment, which you can also do in a platform, and then you can have in the existing ERP, your finance work consists of. And anyone that has reviews and approvals as part of their ERP, then they will be brought into this persona as well. So the magic is really in the combination of both demographics and workflows. But for ERP, I would argue that the workflows here are by far the most important to capture, because that is what drives the entire personalization. And that's what brings you up here on the workflow-based personalization as opposed to demographic. So don't get stuck here on demographics, just focus on workflows, because that's what will capture the difference between two very different people in finance or sales or anything that they do based on how they're actually using the system. And then from that, when you have these different personas, right, what you want to do is creating these activation journeys. And a critical component here that we've seen over time is when you combine communications and enablement, that is what really drives this holistic understanding of oh, what is it that is expected of me? And again, all of this is personalized, right? So if you're in procurement compared to the operations team, you're going to get a very different journey based on what's required of you. And the reason that doing comms and enablement separately is not as effective is that for the end user, it kind of doesn't matter, right? It's something that I need to know, and I need to know how I should operate in this new system, what is expected of me, and if that's communications enablement, it doesn't matter. And when you sequence it, it goes into something called sequential information processing theory. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but if you Google sequential information processing theory, you'll find that it's basically the psychology behind in which order you receive information is going to shape your entire perception of what is being told to you. So if I start, for example, by telling you I'm going to double your salary, everything that I tell you thereafter, you'll perceive very differently compared to if I started by telling you I'm going to double your workload. So it's the order in which people receive information that shapes their understanding of why does this matter and what's expected of me in this change. So if we look at an example of what this could look like, now I'm in my Microsoft Teams environment, and I have just created the sales order for the first time. So the first time I'm clicking in SAP, I'm going to create a sales order. This is then what I'm getting. And this is an example of what we call a trail at Tigerhall, where you then get an entire sequence of how do you master the sales order process. And this is now a combination of podcasts, different formats like videos, power reads, but most of all, it's the order here that matters. And Tigerhall creates this, right? So you don't have to lift a finger, you don't have to do anything. This is all generated and created by AI, delivered to the right people based on AI, and then that's how they receive it in Microsoft Teams. So for example, here, what you see is it starts as a 6-minute podcast. on why sales orders matter more than you think. And it's very critical to begin with something like this before you go into, for example, a quick reference guide. This should come later. So you start with why it matters, and then you talk about the right way, and then it might be a quick reference guide in the end. And in between, you can have these check-ins, which also go back into the persona targeting. So if we start with a podcast here.
Welcome back to Master the Sale.
And then the second piece might be a confidence check. This is what you can then personalize based on as well. So how confident are you in your ability to process a sales order correctly in SAP S/4HANA from creation through delivery scheduling without asking a colleague or use a workaround? People who say I'm very confident compared to people who say I'm not confident at all. Again, personalization data, right? So you can then personalize based on how people respond here. And they can get very different communications, not just reinforcement enablement after something like this. And then you might have a video of exactly how we're doing this.
Welcome. Today, we're going to walk those manual workaround. So, after pricing is locked in, we hit the ATP or available.
And this can then go through all the different steps. And you can also do knowledge checks. So this is an example of what it creates as part of those personalized journeys. And based on what people are responding here, if they say like email the sales manager to approve the order outside of SAP, people respond this, you might want to double down on some specific messaging to them that, hey, like don't go outside SAP, for example. And things like quick reference guides, all built based on who is the person that is receiving this quick reference guide. So it's all personalized to the person receiving it based on those criteria that we just looked at. So both demographics as that foundation baseline, and then the workflow actions, and then also how they respond to these, which is what we call response data and overall engagement data. So they would then get something like this in the moment of need when exactly they're starting that sales order process for the first time. And this would then be different depending on which team they're in and so forth. So that's another key piece in driving alignment is keeps coming back to personalization. And the way that you create this content at scale, right? So this is what Tyrell does in creating those entire trails based on very simple context. So to show you what this looks like, what you do is when you have these personas, you just simply drag and drop the context. So in this example, for this session today, this is the context that I fed it. So from this document, this is 17 pages, and usually whichever vendor you're using as your ERP provider, they would have all of this technical process documentation. So it's just pulling all the technical process documentation and then combine that with your strategy, which is usually a PowerPoint deck or something you've shared in a town hall or similar, which talks about like, digital transformation as a whole, why are we doing this, etc. So it would take a document like this, and everything that we just looked at in that trail is created from this document. So you drag and drop this document, as I've done here, or you just pointed to the knowledge base. So each initiative has a knowledge base. So this is the brain of each of your initiatives. So you can drag and drop your PDFs, PowerPoints, you can point it to a SharePoint site. So just any information that you have about the ERP rollout goes into your knowledge base, and then it pulls from there, or you can just drag and drop it. And then those personas that we looked at, this is where I've now selected a finance persona, for example. Can also add in like sales leadership, maybe frontline customer facing staff. So any personas that you want to create these trails for, and then you just hit next. And then that's how that content is created. So it takes about 60 to 90 seconds to do. Now I did a podcast, you could also do an entire trail. And then you get to an editing step where you're always in full control. So right now we have about a 95% first draft publishing ratio, which means people are seeing the first draft, happy with it, publishing it. And that goes the same for the trails that we saw, but you can always go in here and edit and change things. So super, super easy to create personalization. And this is one of the things that historically has not been possible in change management right before AI. It was way too difficult to personalize at scale and be able to do that to so many different personas. Now you can literally personalize. If you have 50,000 employees, you can have 50,000 podcasts created for each and every one of those different employees. And if you think of what we spoke about with the workflows, every time someone starts the sales order creation process, if they're using it 3 times a week or 3 times a year, all of that can go into personalization, and that all happens automatically. So you don't have to lift a finger to just create all of that personalization. And that's really the driver of alignment, is making sure that people have the why and the how, but that's personalized to them. And languages as well, everything is in 33 different languages, so everything is localized instantly, which I know many organizations have been doing historically as well, just like with a lot of manual work going into like localizing ERP reference documents and things like that. So simplifying all of that to drive alignment. So 33 different languages, all built in, and then you have approval flows, and all of those things are part of it as well. So those are some key things when we look at alignment, and what that comes down to. Now coming to adoption, and as we spoke about, once we have that alignment, so it's personalized to each and every people based on their workflows, who they are, and what they're doing when. It's all about then how do we set this up for that ongoing sustainment and automate the reinforcement, because no organization has the resources or people or time to sit and do ongoing reinforcement. And again, this is one of the great gifts of technology, that we can actually automate this, and we can just set it up once and then it runs. So when we look at how our customers implement ERPs, right, they set all of this up once. So they sit down and look at strategy, which includes that definition of what does adoption mean? Like, what do we actually want people to do in the ERP? And then you set all of that up once, and it can run over 3, 5, 10, 20 years, right? Just catching people when they're out of adoption. So a question here, how would you rate your adoption in your last or current ERP program? And I know some of you mentioned this as one of the biggest challenges as well, with sustained adoption. So how is it going for you right now? And I know half of you were in the planning and like pre-implementation phase, so it might be hard to tell as well. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, so most mixed. Some teams did well, others struggled. You ever comment to have mixed? There are 7% says strong, people adopted quickly and it stuck. Please identify yourselves in the chat so the others can learn from you and reach out to you, because I'm sure you have a lot of good things to share too. And then we have some weak, go live happened, but behavior didn't really change. And then, of course, a lot of too early to tell as well with a pre-implementation. So, but mixed being the common one. Okay, that is great to know. All right, so how do we do adoption well then? So one of the things when it comes to ERP, right, that we mentioned earlier as well, is that the once and done kind of approach isn't really working, because of so many different people are using so many different parts of the system at so many different times and so many different levels of frequency. So it's just a lot of complexity in making sure that people use it in the right way when they do. And if you look at some of the examples here, right, like everyone applies for annual leave, but it's very ad hoc. It's fairly simple, not that high level of complexity. Compare that with the procurement team doing PO processing every day. Higher complexity, but also higher frequency. So easier in some ways, but harder in others. And then in between, where you have like headcount approval, something that people are doing once or twice a year, like medium complexity. So when you start looking at the stakeholder groups, the workflows, the frequency, the level of complexity, you've got such a matrix that it is really hard to do that as a once and done approach, right? And if we go back to our personas, if we think of a few different examples here, just like tactically how this is set up, if you think of annual leave requests, like you might have people do that like every time they start, they might need something different, right? Because people only do it once a year. And then you have the people who do like at least 3 times in the last 7 days. They do either a PO or a sales order. And then a completely different persona might be what you might call like off the like ad hoc decision makers and approvers. So you might have people who approve budget, like budget approval requests, or they get like do performance management with their teams. So this might be a manager audience, and they might do this, say, once a month or like max 12 times in a year. So just these 3 examples would immediately give you like very different personas to tailor and target, right? So they would not be together all in one, because there might be a few people meeting all of these criteria. But think of this as one example, this another example, and this another example. And if you just have as basic, think of that low complexity, right? For the purpose of we only have an hour together. But if you think of that low complexity annual leave request, something as simple as just thinking of every time someone starts creating an annual leave request, then that goes to their manager, and they can then get, at that time they do it, something like this. So they might get, okay, now you approve a new annual leave request, and they get this once they get that action in the ERP. So they get a quick reference guide. This is sent to them. You might want to have this sent to a manager every time someone's applied for leave, or for, say, the first 10 times, if there's a new process in how annual leave should be approved. So then they get a quick reference guide. They can read this. It looks like this, similar to the power read that we looked at earlier. And they get this, how the workflow works, where to go, pre-approval checklist, what should they think about before they approve the annual leave, approving, rejecting, and sending back, like decision making, helping them with that. And if they're going away, troubleshooting if something doesn't work. So they get this as a direct message on Microsoft Teams the moment they are about to do this action. So when they start that approval process, when they team apply for, like, however you set it up, they get it at the right time. So you never have to think about creating all of these SharePoint sites and making sure people go there and sending out links and emails. Like, people will only get what they need when they need it. And then you take this with the same example of people who are maybe approving headcount, like every time there's budget season, every time there is performance management, there might be a new process for how we do performance management, and people only do that once a year, right? So every time there is performance season, once people actually begin that process, that's when they get anything that you send them. So a quick reference guide in this case, but could also be a trail or a podcast or something else that you're sending them. So building it based on this. And on that workflow-based personalization, you can also do this based on like legacy ERP data to see like what workflows people used to do in the past. So if you're transitioning from one to another, or especially if you're just doing an upgrade, so you're upgrading to S/4HANA, then you should have access to legacy data as well. So you can then tailor it based on what people have been doing in the past. And then you might have groups like certain power users. This is the group that we looked at, the occasional decision makers. So this is where you might have, for example, the ones who are approving a budget once in a while, or do performance management, or anything kind of like typically managerial. So that's a group that you can capture. And then you have the ones who are completely new. So like the first time they've just started to do an annual leave request, that's when they get something special. So think about it by behavior, and then everything is automated. So you never have to think about communication plans or training plans or anything. It's just automated based on the actions that people are taking. And when we think of like how often, like when we think of reinforcement models, you probably know the human psychology, or you need 21 repetitions for something to stick. And I think that's a good benchmark to think of in change management and change implementation as well. If something is a process that someone is doing daily, then yeah, make it super intense in those first 3 weeks, but they will probably get it in about a month if they're doing something every day. It shouldn't take more than a month. So you don't have to think about sustainment that long for that purpose, but it's still good to set up in case people drop out later. And also for your measurement purposes, right? So you can see how people move between these different adoption groups over time. And then you think of things that do monthly, like everything around a month and close, for example, you probably want to run that reinforcement for at least 18 to 24 months. But then when you start getting to like performance reviews, which is like, if that's annual, you might want to have that for like 2 or 3 years to reinforce it if it's something that people just do once a year. And then something like annual leave approval might be like for the first time. So you can also then think of this as the first 21 times, and we have some customers who have done this, the first 21 times people do it, they get that reinforcement, but the 22nd time they do something, they don't get anything. So that's how you can then see, are people taking 6 months to get to 21 times, or 2 years, or 1 week, or however long they take. So everything is based around that kind of reinforcement model of 21 times. So just think of different time horizons and time periods when you think of this ongoing reinforcement. Okay, then getting to adaptation. So this is where data becomes so critical. And I feel like most ERP implementations that I'm witnessing are not using nearly enough data as they can. And the purpose of this is really to understand catch issues and see where should you course correct earlier. Who needs more support? Who might already be getting it? Because one thing when we talk about change activation is that many times it's very focused on what people aren't doing and what they should be doing. Like, oh, they're not adopting, so we need to get them to adopt. But equally important for purposes of reducing change fatigue and overwhelm is to not overwhelm the people who are getting it. I would say that's almost as important as making sure that people who aren't adopting something are adopting it. Just don't overwhelm the people who are getting it. If Sally is doing everything perfectly, then no need to reinforce things with her, right? So that's another key component of this, both across adoption, but also when we look at adaptation. So 2 data sets that we look at here to be able to see where should we pivot, where should we change. One is the platform analytics from the change activation platform that you're using, is to see how are they engaging with it, what are they doing, like all of the data across those personas, and then mapping that to ERP usage data, for example. And when you think of the personas we set up, this could then be across the first time they've started doing something. So you might want to see personas the first time they do something, when they complete a workflow, anyone that might still be using old processes. So this is also a bit of a trick, is to, you can also set up targeting and tagging based on people who are doing it the wrong way. And then that shows you data on how many people are still doing it the old way and haven't transitioned. And then maybe features that haven't been touched at all. And all of those data points from the ERP. And then it's really about combining these 2 data sets to see where should you course correct. So to give you an idea of what some of this looks like, if we think of what we've been looking at, like creating a purchase order, or like approving a purchase order, creating a sales order, like anything here, you can then see how many have done this at least 10 times in the last 30 days. And combining then again the workflow data with, for example, the demographics. So if we have the teams in this example, across the sales ops team, Rev Ops, customer success, IT, APAC sales, and EMEA sales, you can then see here how many have created or approved a purchase order in the last 30 days. And then you can switch to see 90 days, to see in the last 12 months, custom range. You can also see this over time. So being able to see trend lines and comparisons over time. And things like snapshot is very commonly used. So if you want to compare, in this case, from 1st of June to 30th of June, how many have approved a PO at least 10 times? And you can see then in sales ops, we have a big uptick in adoption. On 1st of June, we had 42 people in sales ops approving a PO, and then 110 by 30th June. So you can here see that we have 68 more people who have adopted this over the last 30 days. But then contrasting with RevOps, we've lost 12 people. So this is where you can see over time, are we seeing the adoption that we're looking for? Are people actually doing it the right way? And this is where you then configure this based on any kind of, if you want to see like how many have done invoice processing, that's what you can also contrast and compare here. So being able to take those personas that we looked at and then break that down by time trends, snapshots, seeing overviews, that's really where you see adoption progress. And then seeing, are they adopting this workflow in the ERP or not? And then what you do is you take this data and then overlay that with the activation data. So here I have, for example, an order to cash report, like how are we seeing activation by group? And then having this created on, so if we take, for example, group action statistics, the sales order one, and if we take the one that we looked at with most of the new sales order process, you can then see activation data based on either all of them, or you can specify specific groups. So take those, we looked at Rev Ops, for example. You might want to then contrast, like we had a drop in Rev Ops, right? So here we were seeing that, okay, in Rev Ops, we've actually lost 12 people. So 12 people are not adopting this, or we're actually going backwards in adoption. Let's look at APAC, EMEA, and North America and see how their activation data looks like. So this is where you would then select those groups. And then you can select your own, like this is all dummy data. But this is where you can then see like, okay, how much have they, what's their completion status? Have they actually looked at that material? Did they engage with the material? What questions did they have? All of those data points you can get here. And then what is very useful is to then schedule this report to, for example, the managers of those teams. So you might want to schedule this to your RevOps leader in APAC, your RevOps leader in EMEA, and your RevOps leader in North America. So you just select them, maybe that's Angela, Anthony, and Ashley. And then you can have every week. So let's say you want a weekly report sent to them on the adoption of their teams on Monday. And then it never ends. Or let's say you want to have this project finished by the end of the year, you can have this report delivered to them for, let's say, the next 6 months. So this is one of the things that we're seeing is a great adoption driver is when managers then see that, oh, hang on, like my team is not performing as well, or we're behind in adoption in this area. And that comes from exactly layering those two data sources together. So both the fact that you have that ERP data, so that's what you have here, and seeing how is adoption going, what are people actually doing? We want them to do invoice processing at least 10 times, they have not, and then targeting and scheduling this report to their managers. So that's how you then get reporting, and you can get reporting on a ton of different things. There's a lot of data that you can slice and dice in many different ways and build out your own charts, your own dashboards, and for executive reporting and so on too. But the core here is really coming down to using both of these different data flows and overlapping them. And that's where many are then able to pinpoint and see exactly where they should intervene. So in this example here, like you can see the activation data, for example, low in EMEA, and you see invoice matching errors are spiking in EMEA. That's where you can then say that, oh, actually, this is Angelo's team, and we should go have a conversation with Angelo. So a big difference in traditional ways of driving change management and adoption and doing it in the change activation agile way is the fact that you can do much more targeted interventions. So you're able to have data-driven conversations with leaders, with executives, and bring data to the table to see exactly where we're going wrong and why. And then overlapping this with also you have sentiment data, the questions that they ask. So it might be that you then schedule a call with Angelo, who runs the EMEA RevOps team, and you can see that his team has a lot of questions about a specific part of the workflow. And then you can tell him like, hey, this is where we should double down on with your team, for example. So it's a lot about leading to those corrective actions too. So looking at both like learning and what you learn over time, the point of this is also that knowledge really compounds over time, right? So the fact that you can then see in that example with Angelo, you can see these are the type of questions that his team are having about RevOps processes. You know that then when the next module comes or when you roll out the next initiative to them, you can already anticipate what questions they will have, how to personalize the content, and that goes automatically, right? So that personalization comes from the response data, goes into their content and gets sent out, and then also seeing it across different workflows. So it enables you to then do that like very targeted managed training. And again, like don't overwhelm the ones who already get it. Like I think many of us probably remember in school when you were already ahead of the class in math and you were still forced to sit through like math classes that you already knew how to do. That's not a great way of doing education, right? And the same goes for change activation. So targeting and then double down on what you see works, and fine tune that reinforcement cadence is really what this data then brings you to do that leads to speed. So I would say speed is the number one outcome that our customers and others are seeing from applying this kind of approach. And it's both speed in launching new initiatives, but speed in getting adoption, getting to value realization, and especially with that compounding knowledge that becomes this always on loop. And if we look at a case study of someone that did this was a Workday rollout. So they were rolling out a new solution via Workday and did everything that we've discussed. So personalization, the right cadence, the right targeting, workflow actions, all of the above. And they had 95% adoption of Tiger Hall, which was the change activation platform that they used. And they had 94% compliance with the Workday time coding that they were rolling out in just 2 months. And they were initially expecting this to take 12 months because it's a big change. It's a lot of people involved. And this is an example of something similar to like any kind of module that you roll out in any kind of ERP. It's about how quickly can you get people to do it that way with new processes, new ways of working, new ways of thinking. And it's that direct correlation that we many times see. So speed was the number one outcome here as well. It didn't take 12 months. It took 2 months to get to 94% adoption. So looking at the tactical moves, and what we spoke about, so what they were doing is that personalization that we spoke about, like how do we target people by what they do in the system? And you can get this data both from historical ERP data, what different people have been doing in systems, but also looking at what they are doing. So in this case specifically, it was like, who does it, how often, who hasn't started yet, who's doing it once a week, once a month, like all of those things that we've looked at, both when they start and end, frequency of usage, all of those things went into personalization. The timing was very, very key. So looking at the timing of that delivery, so being able to get the enablement, just like we looked at the annual leave example, to deliver it to people where they are on, for example, Microsoft Teams or Slack or Google Chat, or wherever they are on a daily basis, making sure it gets to them in that flow of work based on triggers when they execute a system. And then looking at the ones who aren't taking action. So overlapping that data, like, okay, we're not seeing adoption here. What does the activation data tell us around content engagement levels, like questions people have, sentiment, performance data, all of those matching up to then have these specific sponsor conversations. So the way they described it is it went from being reactive, where in the past they would have leaders come to them and just say like, hey, my team is not adopting it or they're not doing this, to now being able to go out and have proactive conversations and say that, hey, we're seeing exactly where Angelo's team is falling short and this is why. So now we're going out to have a conversation with Angelo to drive that adoption, for example. And again, as with any AI conversation, and I keep emphasizing this, the purpose of using AI and technology in your change activation, right, is so that you can focus more of your time on that super critical human relationship work and interventions, so that your time is not spent on gathering data, producing reports, doing analysis, creating content, doing communications, like all of this manual work. That's what platforms like a Tiger Hall takes care of, so that you can focus on these target interventions and actually go have that conversation with Angelo, get their feedback, see what's happening, and being able to drive this in a very, very targeted way. So having those proactive sponsor conversations became super, super critical in driving that overall success as well. So it comes down to personalization, timing, and those interventions that you can do once you have all the data at your fingertips. So coming to an end on this, so what Tiger Hall does and how this works, and I've showed you some of the screenshots throughout this presentation of how exactly this works in practice. And much of what we've been talking about is what we call workflow actions. And we integrate with SAP, Oracle, Workday, like all your big common ERPs, Microsoft Dynamics, etc. And this is where it comes in from a persona level. So the way Tiger Hall works is you have context and personas. This is the start. So context in this case was that technical process documentation. So that PDF that was 10, 14 pages, that goes into your context. And then personas is what we looked at in those splits between demographics, workflow actions, and also the response data. And then what Tiger Hall does is it creates all of that personalized content. So think all your communications, your enablement, your nudges, reinforcement, guidance materials, anything that you need is created automatically with AI. So it's all AI generated, and that's where the personalization comes from, right? So that's how we can create 50,000 podcasts for 50,000 people is by using AI. And that's what drives the personalization. Gets delivered to them where they are when they need it. So no need to go to any other platform, no need to think about anything else. It just gets into them gets to them through a direct message directly where they are. And then all of this feedback is captured, which gives you all the different data that we've looked at and much, much more. And that's both from a persona perspective. So who's ahead, who's behind, what kind of questions do people have, what sentiment are we seeing, but also from an initiative point of view, when you look at the ERP, what are some leading indicators for success? If we see someone adopting today, what do they do 90 days later? And what do we then need people to do 90 days earlier to adopt 90 days later? So a lot of these predictive analytics is also a big part of it, so that you can adjust and course correct your strategy. And both 6 and 7 here feed back into continuously building your context. So you get smarter and smarter, better and better. Your strategy keeps improving because you actually know what works and what doesn't. And execution always informs strategy, not the other way around. So having that execution data go into your strategy is incredibly powerful. And the same with the persona intelligence going into the personas. So that's how you continuously personalize, the same way as Instagram sees that you look at a reel for 30 seconds longer than any other reel, it will keep sending you more of those. It's the same same philosophy behind here. So we understand what works, what doesn't work, how do different people react to different parts, and then channeling that for personalization. So it becomes this always on flywheel, and a flywheel that keeps learning, keeps getting smarter over time, and keeps doing all of this manual work and all the job for you. So when you think of before and after, many teams that have made this transition, before they used to spend a lot of time on things like building decks and tracking attendance and like spending time on escalations and thinking about like where are we going wrong and why, and then like not doing much sustainment at all. It tends to be very focused on that first massive go live spike, to now looking at the way they work is very much they build it once and then it just delivers. So you end up spending more time on strategy. So you sit down, especially in the beginning. So for those of you who are in the pre-implementation phase or planning phase, that's when you spend time on strategy. You build it once, and then it starts delivering all of that at the right time. And being able to see the data, see that live, see what happens, what is going right, what is going wrong, and then using that data and insight. So not just for reporting, even though executive reporting is great and we all want that, but also using it to shape future rollouts and to shape your strategy in an ongoing way. And then have all of that sustainment and reinforcement just run automatically, while your team is more focused on those interventions and ongoing strategy. So what this usually leads to is that speed, so much shorter time to value, and getting to a 2 month of taking to like 94% adoption in 2 months as opposed to 12 months. And you don't have these like shadow systems because the system captures it, right? So the moment someone doesn't do something for 30 days, that's very likely a signal of someone using a shadow system or a workaround, and it will flag that to you immediately. So you will immediately see that, oh, we have a large portion here that is not using it the way they're supposed to, and that's your signal of shadow work going on. And then you don't want to see these productivity dips, right? So when people are not having to be taken out of operations to go through a bunch of training, they can just continue doing what they're doing. And as and when they keep getting onto the new ERP, they get the enablement at the right time. And that's really what leads to that sustained behavior change over a very, very long time without having to have a team of like 50 change managers running around doing sustainment, right? Because nobody has the resources for that, and it's also not that fun to run around to reinforcement and sustainment. So that's not something that most people want to spend their time on. So in conclusion, it's about shifting it from what are we doing pre-go live to how do we activate and focus on this after go live. That's a big shift in terms of mindset as well, and not treating it like once it's gone live, then it's just all fine and we're done here and now we can move on to our next project. But rather that's the start and beginning of the work to reinforce everything in motion. So some key takeaways: don't segment by demographics only. Don't just look at who they are, which function they're in, and so on. Focusing on what they do, those workflow actions, when they start, when they end, the frequency, how often they do something. All of that goes into personalization. And then tailoring the reinforcement cadence to workflow frequency as well. If someone is doing something once a year, then do reinforcement for 21 years. If someone is doing something once a day, then 3 or 4 weeks is probably enough. And then using data and using both ERP system data and change activation data to see where are we breaking down and layering the two on each other so you can see exactly where you should make those targeted interventions. And that's really what drives sustained, successful ERP implementations over a very long period of time. So happy to take any questions. I know there's some messages in the chats as well. So Julie, if we have any questions or if anyone wants to ask something, feel free. And my contact details are here as well for any further conversations. You know, I'm always happy to chat about this and share best practices and so on. So feel free to reach out as well. But any questions in the chat so far?
Yes, so we have a question from Eduardo. They ask, is the data updated directly from the ERP? How are volumes of processing or sales orders updated per user?
Yes, it's directly from the ERP. So it's integrations. So in the case of Tiger Hall, we have around 800 pre-configured integrations. So that means that you can connect an SAP to a Tiger Hall in just 2 clicks because all the backend data work is already done. So that's the connection integration. So it comes directly from the ERP in real time. And then what you decide is 2 things. So you decide how often does that data feed refresh, So some have it like every minute for specific workflows if it's very like needs to happen now. Some are like daily, depending on what it is, and so on. So you set the refresh cycle, and you also decide the data mapping. So many times when we begin, we set like data mapping, like what are those core workflows? Like for example, I did an example here of annual leave. Annual leave might not be as important, right? So maybe that's a data point that you don't want to feed in. So you decide what are those modules or workflows that you want to focus on, and then that's what the connection and data feed will be about at the frequency that you set. So yes, it's a direct integration with the ERP system, so it's all live and accurate data.
Awesome. Stephen asks, for just-in-time delivery of change comms, what happens if the workflows from the new ERP differ greatly from the workflows of the old system?
Then I would say like works in the same way. So if it's very different, then even more of a reason to have delivery of comms just in time when someone starts it. And what we do then is integrate with that ERP to then see the first time someone does it. And that's a log that then triggers the communication. So it works in exactly the same way. Doesn't matter if they've done it in the old system or not. The only usage for the old system, and I mentioned this a bit, is when you have the data from like the personalization point of view. So you might want to start with, say, everyone who is doing this 5 times a week, for example. If you want to start with something like that, it's great, but it's not a must-have. It's more, I would say that's more icing on the cake. And in 90% of the cases, people just start from scratch with a new ERP system, looking at those core workflows, and then deliver the in-time messaging based on that.
Awesome. Eduardo asks, how complex is the process of reading from the ERP as it is updated quarterly? And also when customers have extensions or custom work done?
Yeah, so extensions, custom work, not an issue. Actually, this one, if you think this case study that we shared here, this is a custom one. So this is an extension. So this was built on like Workday Extend, for example. So it was custom modules that were built within Workday, and that works the same way. So not as complex, and everything that is done on the large global like brand name platforms tend to be very, very easy and straightforward. In case it's something that is very custom and in-house built, it usually takes anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks to build a custom integration for that specific workflow, if it's something that we've never seen in the past, which we usually have seen.
Awesome. Claire asks, can you use org culture assessment as an input to the platform?
Very good question. Yeah, you can. You can use it in 2 ways. It can either be served as the org-wide context. So when we look at context here, this is where we many times feed that in so that the system understands like what is the overall organization all about. It could be like culture, strategy, like different things, but also in personas. So while like demographics tend to be an integration with HRS, for example, workflow actions, in this case, ERP, this persona builder also takes CSV files. So if you have a CSV file of who likes chocolate, who likes mango, you can also personalize based on that, and then tell the people they get a ton of chocolate if they adopt the ERP, right, for example. So the answer is yes, you can absolutely use that.
So Jeanette asks, do you have data that supports the ROI benefit from implementing OCM versus not in these types of projects?
Yes, we do. And there's a ton of third-party data on it as well, in like research and so. Like I have a few ways actually of the best ways to build that case. And it's a bit different if you're building a business case from scratch, if you're measuring something you already have. But I have another session on this coming up in August, if I'm not mistaken. If that's out, Julie, maybe we can put the link to that in the chat too, because there are a few different measurement ways of like ROI and OCM. And I'm going to have a 1-hour session on it then. So feel free to come and I'll share more.
Yeah, it's not out quite yet, but do look out for that in your emails. I'll be sending out an email about that one. And then we have one last question from Brindusa. What is the overlap with LMS? So how are we similar, but also how are we then different from an LMS?
Yeah, so I would say Tigerhole is like sitting one level over an LMS. So if you think of LMS like that is focused on learning, like content and so on, right? That's something that Tigerhole can do, but it also does much, much more than that. So the way that we look at it is learning is a core component of change activation. It's very important, but it's not everything. So you have learning, but you also have communications and the reinforcement and guidance and nudges and everything else, right? We do have many customers actually who have replaced their LMS with Tigerhall, for the reason that Tigerhall is embedded inside Microsoft Teams. It also creates content, it does the personalization and so on. So we have replaced many LMSs, but in the cases where we haven't, you can also link out to the LMS from Tigerhall. So in one of those journeys that I showed the trail, that's where you can then have, for example, one of those pieces be now go do this, say, compliance training on the LMS or whatever you have there. And that can sometimes be an overlapping period as well until they have switched everything into Tigerhall. But many prefer Tigerhall for the Microsoft Teams integration or any platform integration, the content creation, also the data, because they get so much data out of Tigerhall. So that's something they also like to see more of than what they get from their LMS. So that's another reason.
Awesome. Do we have time to squeeze in one last question? We have a little time, Seth.
I have time, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, Steph, I hope you have time. Is your tool able to read workflow actions as part of a process without human interaction, or does it build the material based upon following clicks that users make in the ERP itself? As in, to build content, someone needs to log in and live their life to build that content, right?
Both yes and no. So we actually support both. So the latter, which we call autonomous execution, where it's completely autonomous, it just like builds and delivers, it can do that. What we find is that many are getting to that once they have, first of all, built a bit of confidence in the system overall, and we support approval flows. We recommend having a human in the loop for that approval in the beginning, which basically just make sure you have a human that logs in, checks the content, approves it, and then it goes out. But some that are like super confident with it, that, you know, like they just keep approving everything, then you can also set it to autonomous. And then it does what you described, like it just reads it, creates it, sends it out, and it just goes on autonomously. So I would say it's up to your, say, risk tolerance as an organization, if that's something you want to opt for. But technology is always the easy part, right? Like technologically, it's very possible, but depends on your risk tolerance.
Well, that's all the questions we've got. Do you want to wrap this up?
All right. Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour. And yeah, I'll get an email from Julie on the measurement session as well, so don't miss that one in August. And anyone who'd like to connect for a further chat, feel free to reach out. I'm always available on email, and connect with me on LinkedIn. And I look forward to chatting more with you soon.